Tres excéntricos hermanos comparten una visión que los obliga a salir a buscar la cabeza perdida de su héroe, Pancho Villa, en un mundo plagado de situaciones extrañas. Patitos Feos, una película que combina el western con la comedia surrealista.
Hay que llamar la atención.
Del director Mauricio Chernovetsky. Macabro 2021, Festival Internacional de Cine de Horror de la Ciudad de México. En Cinema 22 de 5 estrellas. Estreno, domingo, 22 horas.
Hola, buenas tardes, queridos amigos y seguidores de Macabro. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos esta tarde en la que nos engalana una charla con pues una gran personalidad en el mundo de los vampiros. Como ustedes saben, este año Macabro está dedicado a los vampiros por cuestión de que también se cumplen 90 años del estreno de Drácula, dirigida por Todd Browning y basada en la novela de Bram Stoker. Esta tarde tenemos una charla con Dacre Stoker, que es ni más ni menos que el sobrino bisnieto de Bram Stoker. Es el encargado del Bram Stoker Estate, que es la entidad dedicada a la investigación genealógica e historiográfica sobre la familia Stoker. Además es coautor de Drácula, El no muerto y Drácula, el origen. Vive en el sur de California con su mujer Jen. Y para llevar a cabo esta charla, que es una charla muy cordial con Dacre, estará Cassandra Vicario, que es miembro del Festival Macabro, es productora de radio, es locutora y es una de las personas que se encarga de investigar y hacer contenidos digitales para el festival. Muchas gracias Dacre por estar con nosotros y le cedo la palabra a Cassandra.
Muchas gracias, Edna. Muchas gracias a todas las personas que están conectadas en este momento con nosotros para tener esta pequeña conversación tan maravillosa sobre vampiros con una persona que conoce muy bien del tema. Es un gusto para mí compartir la siguiente hora con el señor Dacre Stoker. Dacre, muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros esta tarde.
Thank you, Cassandra. And I also thank the organizers of the Festival Macabro and also my publisher, Planeta, all the people behind the scenes that help bring this incredible book and this festival to all of you today. It's a great thrill to be sharing my story, but my story is actually Bram Stoker's story. And along with J.D. Barker, we've written Dracula, El Origen. I'm going to bring you some of the research today of my great-granduncle Bram Stoker and what went into his life and how some of those things actually moved into this famous novel Dracula, published in 1897. And then I'll continue on with what information I used from there, along with J.D. Barker, to go into Dracula, El Origen.
Perfecto, Dacre. Adelante.
So I love cover art, so I'm going to share with you some of these early edition covers of Dracula. They're just it gives me this great feeling to think of this as a novel that has been going since 1897 in over 30 languages, 1,000 editions. It's never been out of print. It did go in public domain in 1962. Over 700 movies have a Dracula vampire in it since 1922. and over 1,000 comic books and stage adaptations. And it makes me think of the popularity today, but also back in Bram Stoker's day, it actually was quite a popular and scary book. The first time I actually read this book, I was a young boy growing up in Montreal, Canada. And quite honest, at the age of 13 years old, I really didn't understand it very well. It was scary, but I didn't understand that this really had a lot of ideas and thoughts and concerns of the people during the time that Bram wrote it, between 1890 and 1897, the Victorian era. So it's like a looking glass to go back in time. So when I reread the story in university, when I got more serious and could properly understand it, I realized this really is a special book because it gives people an idea of the origins of Gothic horror, but also it tells all about what people knew at the time of the supernatural, the occult, and all the superstitions that were floating around the world at the time.
Dacre, perdóname
yes,
que te interrumpa. Quisiera preguntarte algo en particular. Drácula es publicada en 1897, pero en 1819 Polidori publica El vampiro. Y en este cuento, el vampiro principal es Lord Ruthven. Sin embargo, creo que Drácula, sin lugar a dudas, es el vampiro, el jefe vampiro, ¿no? El vampiro por antonomasia, el más importante. ¿Por qué crees que Drácula tiene este estatus y no Lord Ruthven?
You know, it's a really good question. And you think of just because you were first, like Polidori's The Vampire, doesn't always mean it's the best or has the most attention. One of the things about Polidori's story is it was actually written on the shores of Lake Geneva, the same time Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. So these two were, you know, some of the greatest early Gothic novels. So don't take anything away from it. But what Bram Stoker did was he attached a real person, Vlad the Impaler, to the name Dracula. He attached real places, Whitby, England, where the Count arrives. All the places in the story are real in London, in and around London, and back in Transylvania. So what Bram did was take the story that was supernatural, but he made it believable and real. And Cassandra, that's why I think that sticks today. And it still resonates today because it's so darn realistic.
I agree.
Now, let me just tell you, the last 15 years of my life, I have been digging into a lot of interesting archives, libraries, museums, private collections. So I wanted to share with you folks what goes into researching Bram Stoker's life, but also how an author, or in our case, two authors, J.D. Barker and myself, how we go about researching to write even a great fictional novel. And so I had to figure out, with the help of experts, what were the most important documents in the world, where were they, to find out what Bram Stoker left us. Because he didn't write an autobiography. He didn't leave us any clues himself. Even to a family member, he didn't say to his son, this is why I wrote Dracula. This is what inspired me. And this is one of the really cool mysteries. Even right now, 124 years after the novel was written, we're still looking for, where did he get these ideas? Where did he come up with these things? Was he a crazy man? Was he on drugs? Was he depressed? No, he was really a normal person, but he had some very interesting problems, let's say, in his life that I'll tell you in a moment. But this is where I got all my information from. Number one, the notes for Dracula, 125 pages for his notes. They've now been published, but they also live in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. There is one and one only typescript. That's the actual typing of his novel that the co-founder of Microsoft actually owns, Paul Allen, and I've had a chance to analyze it. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see Bram Stoker's Lost Journal. Well, I discovered it in Bram Stoker's great-grandson's attic in England, and it shows an accumulation of his thoughts of 11 years when he was still in university and a young man working. Very interesting ideas. There is one-in-one interview only where Bram Stoker was asked, why did you write Dracula? And it was by Jane Stoddard, and I'll tell you about that in a few moments. And lucky for me that these great grandsons I mentioned, they were raised by Bram Stoker's son, because their father died in World War II. So they are still alive today, and they have memories of what Bram Stoker's son has told them about his father. Now, there are 5 biographies written by other people who have looked at some of these very same notes. Some of them are better than others. Some of them have the benefit of new discoveries as well. And then something that's very interesting, as I said, more discoveries are still happening to this day. The Swedish and the Icelandic versions of Dracula have been sitting in plain sight since 1899 and 1901, and up until just a few years ago, before Hans de Roosch and Richard Burkhardt actually found that they were different stories. And there is still debate to this day. Did Bram Stoker write it? It sounds awful similar. And I'm going to give you some of my opinion on that later. The academics of the world spend a lot of time analyzing the novel Dracula. And I'm lucky because I read some of these papers. I get to go to these conferences and I learn a lot. And one of the other things I'm going to share with you is Bram loved maps. He liked maps to figure out the train schedules. He also liked to figure out Jonathan Harker's route through Europe to travel through Romania to this fictional castle Dracula. And I will show you his map that he used for this just in a few moments. So as I said, my life as a review has been connecting the dots, using this new information that we find, drawing conclusions, searching for the truth, because sometimes it's interesting to find the difference between what is real and what is fiction. And when I write fiction, I like people to get confused between the truth and fiction. And Bram Stoker did the same thing back in 1897, and that's why his novel is so popular to this day. Now, his life I've described, and his writing of Dracula, as a perfect storm. It's a term when many things together to make something really horrifying, really big. And so you've got to just bear with me as I tell you a few important things from Bram's life, not a full biography, but he was born in 1847 in just outside of Dublin, Ireland. And it was a time when they actually had horrible disease, people dying in the streets from cholera epidemics, potato famines. They actually called it Black 47. So imagine this young boy just outside of the city, sickly for the first 7 years of his life himself, looking outside and having death and disease, almost walking zombies going around because it was such a horrible situation. The Stoker family was okay. The father had a good job. They grew their own food. They had chickens. They had food. But the mystery was Bram Stoker's illness. We just didn't know what caused him to be bedridden and very sick for the first 7 years of his life. I'm going to tell you in a moment that I think he was bloodlet. And that's a rather strange cure that we'll get to in the next slide or two. But luckily, he did recover at the age of 7 or 8. And as you can see by this picture in the middle, he became a champion, very strong man, a champion athlete at Trinity College. So while he was there, he just flourished as an athlete, but also as a scholar in charge of the Philosophical Society, the Historical Society, debating and acting. He was really a big man on campus. But his father retired from his job at Dublin Castle, which was the seat of British power, and Bram had to take a job on top of everything else he was doing. And he took a very boring job. They needed the money, and he became a clerk in the Petty Sessions legal department. But if you're like me, part of our brain is very analytical. This is the Bram Stoker part, who's like the money counter and all the laws have to be just right. The other part is the creative writer. And that was Bram Stoker, the actor, the writer. So he had two sides of his brains, which were constantly in conflict. And sometimes one side won out over the other. As a break, as getting away from this boring job, he would go to the theater. And he loved it so much that he wrote theatrical reviews, which he gave to the newspaper, incidentally, the same newspaper that author Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu was the editor of. He wrote the famous female vampire story, Carmilla.
Yes.
So he gave stories of theatrical reviews to Le Fanu. But also during this time when he was a young boy, we have records that Bram was told stories by his mother and his nanny. They kept him entertained for 7 years while he couldn't be educated properly. But to keep his mind engaged, they told him stories of Irish folklore, mythology. And listen, Irish folklore mythology was very dark. They were cautionary tales. Just like the picture you see here, they are about Irish vampires. So the vampires were not just in Transylvania and Serbia and these places, Poland. And the final picture up on the right-hand side is when Bram was old enough to finish his degree at Trinity College, he got the job offer of a lifetime. And this was working for Sir Henry Irving. Irving saw one of his reviews. He loved it so much. Irving said, I want you to come to London and help manage my theater and be my manager. This was the break of a lifetime, gave Bram a chance to go to London, work in the theater, but also it made his writing become much more popular, and he got access to newspapers as well as to publishers. So this brings me to, how do we write Dracula, the origin? How do we do this? Well, as J.D. Barker and I were looking into all these different mysteries, I presented to J.D. the mystery of Bram's illness and some facts that I found. This treatise on the left-hand side of the page shows that Bram had an uncle who was a very famous doctor and famous for bloodletting. And bloodletting, in a nutshell, is the fact that in those days, people didn't understand about infection in the blood. They didn't have antibiotics. They simply cut open the body, like you see in the picture here, or they put leeches on the body and took away all the blood, not just the infected part of the blood. And in this treatise, it actually said what to do for young children is take out enough blood until the child passes out. And then to rehydrate them, give them oil and claret, which is red wine. So can you imagine if this did happen to Bram, and I think it did, that he would have the blood taken out of him until he was passing out, which would make him very hazy. And then to recover, he'd be given this alcohol and oil, which would make him drunk probably for the next day or so. So increasingly changing his mental facilities. And I think that was a very strong message to this poor little boy. And on and off for 7 years, I think that's a state that he lived in. But somehow he recovered from all this. And he became a champion athlete. And this is something, as a coach myself at the Olympic level, I was wondering, how does somebody recover from being a bloodlet and very sick kid to becoming a champion athlete? And that's where we got the idea of possibly an interaction with the supernatural might have something to do with it. So what if it was true? That's the basis, part of the basis for Dracula, the origin story. Now, the other part, and there are many, but here's just a few to share with you today. I know that this was true, that Bram Stoker's mother survived herself. He was very lucky. In 1932, when she was 14 years old, the cholera epidemic in Western Ireland. Now, imagine, folks, what we're living through right now, this COVID pandemic around the world. At the very beginning, nobody really knew where it was coming from, how it was getting into our bodies. And the same thing was happening with cholera. They thought it was in the air. They didn't understand at the time about germ theory. They didn't realize that the diseased people had it in their bodily fluids. And when they touched somebody and the perspiration or the blood got on them, or when the body was put in the ground and the body decomposed, it would go into the water supply of the town and people would drink the water and they'd get sick. They had no idea what was going on. It was horrifying. Hundreds and hundreds of people would die. And Mrs. Stoker, at that time, she was Mrs. Thornley Blake, she survived. But she witnessed misdiagnosis by the doctors, premature burial of people who were not quite dead. And this actually happened to one of the Stokers, one of the Blake's neighbors, where a lady was put into the mass grave and her husband went to say and give his last regards and found her still alive with all the bodies and helped her drag out. Now, can you imagine a young boy, bloodlet and drunk with all these things in his body, and he hears these stories of people being misdiagnosed and buried prematurely and dragging themselves out of the undead bodies? I really think this gave him a very dark sense of imagination, and it came back into his psyche when he started writing many years later. Because as we know, when children are young, they're vulnerable to these horrible ideas. Well, what you see on the screen in front of you is the actual account. Bram Stoker was so moved and affected by the story, he asked his mother to send it to him. And this is one of the pages. So now we get to a comparison, so to speak. What was going on in Dracula the novel? What did J.D. Barker and I use in Dracula El Origin? First of all, Dracula novel was written in a very special style that wasn't very popular at the time, called the epistolary style, using memos, newspaper articles, journals, that sort of thing. Well, J.D. and Barker and I did the same thing. Bram Stoker used real life situations that Bram mentioned in his notes, mentioned in his journal, in Whitby and in Cruden Bay, Scotland, and in London. Also, Jonathan Harker, Bram's main character, is very similar to Bram Stoker himself when you learn to study Bram. Bram was asked to be a lawyer by a certain bar association, Temple Bar, but he refused it because he liked his job in the theater. Well, of course, Jonathan Harker is a young lawyer. Bram did a lot of historical research at the London Library, which I'll share with you in a couple of moments, as well as the Whitby Library. And then a character that we use in our story, Arminius Vanbury, I am convinced, I know he's a real person, but I'm also convinced he was a source of information for Bram Stoker about who Vlad Dracula was. And then one of the most influential books that's in the London Library, called The Land Beyond the Forest by Emily Gerard, a Scottish lady who was living in Transylvania that was very interested in superstitions in her native Scotland. And when she moved to Transylvania with her husband, who was a cavalry officer in the Austrian-Hungarian cavalry, she got interested in Transylvanian superstitions, and Bram read that book. And that's exactly what Bram needed to attach to the vampire superstitions. They're all there. People really had superstitions and concerns about vampires coming out of the graves. She wrote it there, and Bram used it. This picture you see down below in the bottom left-hand corner is the town of Whitby, where Bram visited and placed chapter 6, 7, and 8 there. J.D. Barker and I had to do the same thing, and you'll see that in a few moments. And then this castle you see on the right-hand side is in the town where Bram Stoker actually wrote the novel Dracula, and he visited this castle. And I'll tell you something very interesting and strange. The interior of this castle is exactly as described in chapter 2 of Dracula. The fictional castle looks just like the inside of this castle. So I am convinced that Bram visited it, and he was so interested with this octagonal room that he simply took that information and put it inside his fictional castle. So again, using real places, real people, and simply moving them around as authors do, J.D. Barker and I did the same. And the final piece of this page is that Bram Stoker loved new science and technology. As a matter of fact, if he was alive today, he would have the latest iPhone, the latest equipment for information. Back in the day, he was interested in a lot of different science and technology as a way to say, we must harness and use this power wisely if we want to overcome the ways of the supernatural that could dictate us. So let me just ask you a question now, all you people that are Dracula fans, you've watched the movies, you've read the books. All of these pieces of technology occur in Dracula, the novel. Some of them go into the movies as well. Can you just figure out where they all appeared? And since I can't see the hands being raised, I'm going to obviously have to tell you the answers. But just before I do, Just look at yourself and see where have they been used, because every single one of them, look at the dates, are very brand new. And so what Bram was saying to his readers, this is new information. This is new emerging technology, new sciences. We need to embrace it. We need to use it. So here's a couple of answers for you. Middle of the page, mesmerism. This is the mind control that the vampire would have when he has a blood exchange with somebody. And in the case of Dracula, of course, he had a blood exchange with Mina. She can tell where Dracula is going. That's why she directed the band of heroes to chase after him in the boat and up the rivers to Dracula's castle. The phonograph on the right-hand side, that's very new. It's a recording phonograph. Dr. Seward would talk into it. He would talk to his notes into it. They can come out in a cylinder. She would replay it and type all the responses on a typewriter. That was new also at the time. She would hand all the pages to Van Helsing, who would then get all the notes from all the different characters. And that's how we understood what was happening. It took Mina, the modern woman, not many women in those days was even allowed to use a typewriter, but Bram was a bit of a feminist, and he said, she is going to be the one that provides all the information to these heroes. They wouldn't have been heroes without her information. And finally, this Kodak. It's actually a Kodak camera, but back in the day, it was simply called a Kodak, and Jonathan Harker took pictures of the maps and the properties with him all the way to Transylvania to show the Count what he was buying. After all, that's why Jonathan Harker went to Castle Dracula, to close the deals of the houses he was buying. Now I'm going to let you look at this page while I take a sip of my tea and just look at this just for a minute without me saying anything. It's the most important page of all of Bram Stoker's notes. And here is the hint, folks. Look at the underlined red. The Count. Count, something crossed out. Vampire. The name Vampire was the original name of Bram's vampire, and he got it from the books talking about vampires in Austria. This is where Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu wrote Carmilla. And by looking at Bram's notes, we understand he was going to set the novel in Austria, along with an Austrian name for a vampire. Do you think for a moment that the name Vampire would be as strong and resonating as Dracula? Certainly not. So lucky thing he changed it. And look what he did that day. This is what authors do, is we all write the names of our characters, and you can see them here on the screen, and a little bit about them. But he must have got very excited when he wrote Dracula, because look what else he did. Dracula at the top of the page. Dracula again at the top of the page. And then with great confidence, sticks his pen in the inkwell and writes Count Dracula. Folks, this is the Genesis page of Dracula in English Gothic literature. This is where it all began. It could have been Vampire, but for a couple of books that I'll show you later. Now, you'll see all the other names here. Some of them he didn't use. A detective, Cotford. Now, Ian Holt and I used that guy in the story Dracula the Undead. That's where Cotford came from. Some of the other characters didn't make it into the novel, and I used them from time to time, some of Bram's original thoughts, in different stories that I will be writing. Now, one of them that Bram wrote that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, look at this at the very bottom, in pencil, mem as memo, secret room, colored like blood. There is no secret room colored like blood in Dracula, but in the Icelandic and Swedish versions, which might have been an early adaptation, an early draft, who knows, of Bram's novel, because some of these ideas come from his notes. There is a blood red room, actually two of them, in the Swedish and Icelandic version. One in the bottom of Castle Dracula, where there are actual human sacrifices with blood all over the place, done by half ape, half people, persons. So just a little bit of a hint that some of these ideas did make their way into the Swedish and Icelandic versions. Now, just before I go from this page, look at this on the left-hand side. I've written a Texan, Quincy Morris. Now, I wrote Buffalo Bill Cody because Buffalo Bill in American history is a very famous cowboy. Bram Stoker met Buffalo Bill, the real Buffalo Bill, and him and Irving brought him over to London to put on his Wild West show. Bram Stoker based his character, Quincy Morris, on Buffalo Bill, and funnily enough, in two other stories that Bram Stoker wrote, he based a character off Buffalo Bill. He was a very interesting and colorful American cowboy that Bram inserted into the story to show that he loved America, and it was new and brash and powerful, not always under control. That's probably why the Texan, Quincy Morris, is the only band of heroes who actually died in the novel Dracula. Now I'm going to share with you one of these most recent discoveries. I was contacted by this gentleman here, Mr. Philip Spedding, to say, I need you to come over to London. We've just discovered something in the London Library. What did you discover? All these books over here. These are 28 books that Bram Stoker used for his research. I said, how did you know that? He said, well, he wrote in the margins in pencil. And I go, oh my goodness, I was very embarrassed. But he said, no, don't worry, because this has just proven that our library is the genesis point for all of Bram's research. So I found that very interesting. So I went over there and I looked at all the books and I helped him decipher that these were actually Bram Stoker's notes. Now, how did I do that? Because two of the books that they have were donated by Bram's son after Bram died, and they had the exact same markings in the margins. So it shows us what Bram Stoker was interested in, what caught his eye when he was reading his books and then writing his notes. Here's an example of a couple of these books. On the Truths of Popular Superstition and Mesmerism. This is a new science that's being brought up, and it's written by Herbert Mayo, a medical doctor. So not just a crazy guy thinking about, mind tricks or seances with a Ouija board. This was a very famous medical doctor. And look at the middle page here. Look at some of the letters. These are the table of contents. Vampirism, unreal ghost, true ghosts, trance, tranced sleep, half-waking trance. This is where he got all the ideas that was presently science written by a medical doctor to use with Lucy doing her trance walking and so on. And vampirism, again, not just crazy people thinking of crazy ideas, things in a medical book. Another book that was in the London Library actually showed us that Bram Stoker was interested in the devil when he was choosing his name, Dracula. This book, and if you look over on the left-hand side, this is his notes, and you see my red dotted line, C. Samuelson, Romania, page 146. Well, this is the book by Samuelson called Romania, Past and Present. I'm sure Bram Stoker read the whole book, not just page 146, but on page 170, we see that Bram Stoker did know who Vlad the Impaler was, a voivode of Wallachia. Of course, Bram Stoker changed him to a Prince of Transylvania, which is the next province over. But his nickname was the Devil. And that is what my great-granduncle is looking for. A real-life person with a horrible history who has a reputation and a nickname of the Devil. He also found, remember I told you he loved his maps. This is one of the maps that was in the book. And Bram Stoker was very precise when he was bringing people across the country for the theatrical troupe. He brought his character across the country in a train, from London in a boat, to Paris in train, to Munich, to Vienna, to Budapest, to Klausenburg. Now you see the map, the black line, to Bistritz. And then, funnily enough, to where my red arrow is pointing and the black arrow is touching, the Borgo Pass. This is not a made-up name, folks. We know that Jonathan Harker took the carriage ride in the Borgo Pass, where he met the strange and mysterious carriage driven by the man in black. Round and round he went in the night. He didn't know where he was, but when you analyze where he went, and because he left us the lines of longitude and latitude in his notes, we find that underlined Mount Kiliman Isvarar is where Bram Stoker chose to have his fictional castle. This is the exact place where J.D. Barker and I chose to have our castle. Now, if you have not read Dracula the Origin yet, I'm not going to spoil it to you, but I'm going to give you a hint. At the very end of the novel, Mina Murray somebody else, and I can't say her name, hands a piece of paper to Bram Stoker, crumbled up, and keeps it in a box. And he opens it up years later, and he sees the exact coordinates on this map that Bram Stoker has in his notes. And what is that for? To show Bram Stoker the location of the fictional castle. And I have now been there, and I've actually discovered this place. So this brings us back a little bit more to the novel Dracula the Origin. It's been very popular and sold all around the world. And I have to talk a little bit now about J.D. Barker, my co-author, because I could never have done it without him. He is an excellent suspense and horror writer. I met him at the Horror Association, which is writers of America that come together. And J.D. Barker and I were sitting together when we were signing autographs for our books. He had a book called Forsaken, which is very good. And I loved it. And I said, J.D., what a great book. I said, you've got a particular character in there, the nanny of the children, which scares me to death. And at the time, I had a young child myself, and my wife and I needed help. So we had a nanny. And one of the scariest things for me personally that J.D. Barker touched on was what would happen if your nanny that you entrust the health of your child with and the safety was not all that it seemed. And JD and I struck up a friendship, and I said, I got an idea for a story. Can I pitch it to you tomorrow? I need somebody to collaborate with me. And we had breakfast with his wife the next morning. He loved the idea, the origin story of Bram Stoker writing Dracula. So we came to an agreement on how things would be done. We basically took turn writing different parts of the story, but JD was a master of blending it together. One of the problems when you have two people writing a story is that you'll get two very distinct and different voices. Sometimes that works in a book, and sometimes it doesn't. We wanted one voice, so he was the predominant writer, but he took all my research, all my writing, and blended it into his words. Now, I've got to tell you, and I want to share with you, I'm going to read this to you. This is what I read to J.D. Barker when I was trying to convince him to write the story with me. And I said, you know, JD, in authors' lives, we always look at things and say, what if this really happened? And this is no secret, but Bram Stoker did the same thing in the Icelandic and Swedish edition, but for some reason, his London publisher took it out because I think it was too scary. So I'm going to read this to you. This preface only shows up in Iceland and Sweden, not in London, England. I am quite convinced that there is no doubt whatever that the events here described really took place, however unbelievable and incomprehensible they might appear at first sight. And I am further convinced that they must always remain to some extent incomprehensible, although continuing research in psychology and natural sciences may, in years to come, give logical explanation of such strange happenings, which, at present, neither the scientists nor the secret police can understand. All the people who have willingly or unwillingly played a part in this remarkable story are known generally and are well respected. Both Jonathan Harker and his wife, who is a woman of character, and Dr. Seward are my friends and have been so for many years. I've never doubted they were telling the truth. Cassandra, does that sound like a compelling story that this novel is real?
Absolutamente, suena demasiado interesante, te llama mucho la atención y nos hace pensar que Bram en realidad creía en los vampiros y que todo lo que nos narra en Drácula es basado en hechos reales.
I'm glad you agree, because look at this next slide. When I show JD this is actually a quote from the novel, and I believe this is what Bram Stoker, my great uncle, really believes. It's in chapter 18. There are such beings as vampires. Some of us have evidence that they exist. Even had we not the proof of our own unhappy experience, the teaching and the records of the past give proof enough for sane people. I admit that at the first I was a skeptic, were it not that through the long years I have trained myself to keep an open mind. That's another shorter, obviously very powerful statement. What do you feel about that one too?
Para mí es emocionante porque me gustan mucho los vampiros y el saber o el tener esa esperanza de que Bram creía en ellos y que de alguna forma existieron, por lo menos en su momento, en su mente, es algo que es realmente emocionante para los fanáticos, para quienes conocemos Drácula y la hemos leído, y es realmente emocionante que alguien como Stoker creyera en los vampiros y nos regalara este libro tan maravilloso y sus dos versiones que ahora se conocen, ¿no?
You see, the main important thing is he's trained himself to keep an open mind, and that is the key in the story. We might not be able to understand spirits and where they go and the paranormal, and even if the vampire that comes out of the grave and sucks the blood, in that sense, is that real? But if you keep an open mind, you may understand these things later on when we can develop proof. That's the strength of this story. That really is the power of the story. So it's time to introduce you to the rest of the family, because we've got young Bram Stoker here when he just recovered from his illness. So if you've read Dracula the Origin, you don't understand who these people are. Matilda, his sister; Thornley, his brother, who is a very famous surgeon. We'll learn about him later. And then the nanny, Ellen Crone, who, funnily enough, this is the only picture that ever exists with Ellen. She stayed with the family until she died. It's the only picture we've ever found of her. And then Bram Stoker, when he was about 21 years old, his brother Tom, and then Bram's father, also named Abraham. Bram shortened his Abraham to be Bram, and luckily Charlotte Stoker survived the cholera epidemic. Otherwise, none of these people would be here, and I wouldn't be here either, because she is my great-great-grandmother. Now, Matilda in real life was an artist, and as JD and I were creating our characterization of our people, we had great confidence when my wife actually found some of Matilda's artwork. And if you look closely at this artwork on your screen, you'll see why the Putnam Publishing Company in the US took this work and used it on the spine of the book. And the main reason is these are snakes in this design. And I won't spoil it to you, but I'll just tell you, they're featured in the book. The other thing that's featured on the screen in front of you is some china that Matilda Stoker really did design and paint. You can see on the back of this plate that my wife bought from eBay, from all the way from Paris, it says designed and painted by Matilda Stoker, 1870. So that gave me and JD great confidence that we could have Matilda go to Paris during our story, because she really did go there and she really was an artist. And then we go back to the brother, who is featured as one of the main characters in our story. Why is that? Because he really was a famous doctor, and sadly enough, his wife really did suffer from mental problems and have to go into an asylum. but this was a very interesting doctor. He was very advanced, and I believe the fact that he was a physician as well as a psychiatrist, that he was the model for Dr. Seward. This diagram you see right here is Thornley Stoker showing his brother Bram how to actually conduct the surgery called brain trephination on Renfield in chapter 21. So this was a very interesting doctor. He was the oldest brother in the family. He did all sorts of operations on and was very interested in fixing people who did go insane. And that's why Bram and him have such not an easy time, but the possibility to create the character Renfield, because they really did interview people who were insane. So Arminius Vanbury is one of the main characters in the story, and I'll just speed up a little bit so we can get to the end of our section on movies. But I wanted to let you know that this is the proof that I have, and it's the dinner table that shows Arminius Vanbury on the right-hand side, right next to Tom Stoker, sitting at a table with Bram Stoker, BS, bottom left-hand side, Henry Irving, Mrs. Stoker. All these people had dinner together, April 30th, 1890, just 2 months before Bram Stoker went off to Whitby. He had started writing Dracula at the time. And I'm sure that this guy, who was a professor at Budapest University and was an expert in the Ottoman Empire and Austrian-Hungarian Empire, was the guy that told him to check out Vlad the Impaler. And why is that? Because in chapter 18 of Dracula, you see in blue, I've asked my friend Arminius of Budapest University to make his record. And from all that means they are, he'd tell me of what he has been. He must have been that Voivode Dracula who won his name against the Turk. It goes on, and one more reference. The Draculas were, says Arminius, a great and normal race. And it goes on to say they had dealings with the evil one, of course, the devil, and that they went to the Sholomonts, that's Emily Gerard's School of the Dark Arts in the mountains of Transylvania. So this is the guy who is a source of information. Bram, of course, this is why J.D. Barker and I had him as a main character in our story. Now, quickly, we go to Whitby, Yorkshire, J.D. and I, to write our story, because a lot of it happens there, just like Dracula did. It had just the right atmosphere for a Gothic novel. You've got a graveyard. You've got, by daytime, the place looks very comfortable, but at night, not so much. And you actually see Bram Stoker's notes for describing the town. He wrote over 20 pages of notes describing this town. And you can see on the bottom right-hand screen the 199 steps that go from the beach all the way up to the Abbey. Interestingly enough, they had a library there as well. This is the second book by Mr. Wilkinson called The Principalities of Wallachia, Moldavia, that mentioned Dracula as the devil. So he has two books, one by Samuelson in London, one by Wilkinson in Whitby, that talks about the devil for our Vlad the Impaler. So this is key right there. In the language, it means devil. And now the mysterious voyage of the Demeter, which has been so popular, not only in Dracula, but extracted and other books written about it. What's so special about it? It was real. There was a real wreck of the Dimitri in 1885. And you actually see the page here that one of the Coast Guard men gave Bram Stoker. Look at the bottom. The Dimitri was the Russian schooner. And it describes the exact same way that the ship wrecked in a horrible storm on the beach. Bram Stoker just took it, changed the name, and added the big black dog jumping off it. He wanted to make it realistic. Go ahead, Cassandra.
Dacre, ¿por qué crees que Stoker no fue más detallista o no nos platicó más de todo lo que pasó sobre el Demeter en Drácula?
That's a great question. You know, I think there's two reasons for that. Number one, most books in those days weren't much longer than 500 pages. And his book was 485. Paper was very expensive. But I also think, and he had to cut some out. He had to cut 101 pages out of the beginning. So I think he just didn't have enough space for the voyage of the Demeter. It is such a cool part of the story, but I think he was also trying to build some suspense because we only learn about what went on in the voyage by the dead captain's ship's log. And by reading the ship's log, there's still a lot of your imagination that has to happen to figure out what really happened on that voyage. But as you and I have talked about, it's so cool that other authors and people making movies are using this as an opportunity because it's a mystery part of the book, don't you think?
Así es, así es.
Yeah.
Hay un autor mexicano que tiene un texto sobre el Demeter, José Luis Zárate, y el libro se llama La Ruta del Hielo y la Sal. Muy interesante.
That's so cool. I look forward to seeing that. So quickly, here's some other places in the town that are really there. The Duke of York pub, I've stayed there myself. And of course, the characters in Dracula, the origin, have stayed there. And the 199 steps are very famous going from the beach up to the Abbey. This is what the Abbey looked like in Bram Stoker's day. It doesn't look like it now because that center tower was bombed by the Germans in World War I. But this is the tower where Bram Stoker was in our novel, Dracula, the Origin. This is where all the now sections are. So that really was there as it was supposed to be, as was this place. Look at the arrow. It shows not the regular graveyard, but the unconsecrated, the suicide graveyard. People who had committed suicide were not allowed to be buried by the church in the regular graveyard. That's where some of the action happens in our novel. And then the interview conducted by Jane Stoddard. I'll just tell you this. Bram Stoker said, when she asked him, what is your story based on? A very fascinating theme since it touches on mystery and fact. In the Middle Ages, the terror of the vampire depopulated whole villages. And then it goes on to list 13 countries that he found research that said they had vampires in their folklore. That's powerful. This is other pieces where we see information in the libraries about vampires that were going through Europe. And I'll just tell you the short version, folks. It's mostly because they didn't understand contagious diseases like the plague. And in this one here with the brick in the mouth, this was in Italy because the bodies were in a very shallow grave. And when the bodies decomposed, the jaws came down and crunched. And the people who were living on the top, who survived the plague, listened and heard crunching noise. And they were scared to death that the bodies were trying to come out of the grave and take the life from the living. So they dug up the graves, and anybody they suspected as a vampire, and those were people with bloated stomach. Of course, that happens when the body decomposes. They put a brick in their mouth so they couldn't chew their way out. And this is what these treaties are all about. Bram saw also these other treaties as well. It was all during plagues that went through Europe. Look at the dates, 1700s. They didn't understand germ theory, so they thought it was vampires. The same thing happened in America. You'll see in another slide. Bram simply took all this information of superstitions and folklore from these treaties, put them in his story, and made people think it was real. And these are all the traits. You can look on the left side: influence over rats, no looking glass in the house of the count, enormous strength. These are all the traits that were real thoughts that people believed vampires had. Again, Bram Stoker made it real. Just like this article in the New York World newspaper that shows over 50 exhumations of graves because people thought vampires were running about, but it was only tuberculosis that was killing people, not the vampires. And the end of this article actually shows Charles Darwin saying, he was the famous scientist that wrote The Origin of the Species, that vampire bats came out of the trees and drank the blood from cattle. Bram Stoker took that and put it in Quincy Morris's mouth and said, yes, I know vampires. When I was in South America, the bats came out of the trees and drank the blood from my horse, putting together the natural and the supernatural. And one of the last things to tell you, I said earlier, 101 pages were taken out of Dracula. Well, I can tell you that J.D. Barker and I researched this and found that Dracula's Guest, the short story that you can buy, and you can probably get it for free, was part of Dracula at one point. And it shows young Jonathan Harker going to Munich and stopping there for a night, and he has an encounter with a vampire in a dead village, the village of the damned. That's why J.D. Barker and I ended our story, Dracula the Origin, at the same place Bram Stoker planned to start his novel Dracula. And if you love the story and you love movies, the good news is that our story has been purchased. The film rights have been purchased by Paramount, and Andy Muschietti will be the director if he stays as the director. It might change, but he was the guy that directed Stephen King's It. So quickly, we're going to move on to some questions about movies. And before you get it, you just got to understand that you've got literature, you've got movies, but Dracula has gone everywhere in popular culture. And we're just going to watch now one of a montage of film clips to get us in the mood to end our discussion with Cassandra with about my favorite movies, her favorite movies. And it will give you a really cool feel of how the Dracula movies have really changed throughout the years. But before we do that, I'm just going to tell you, you've got to take a look at this slide. It's a bit of a comic one, and see if you can choose your favorite Dracula, and also in the film clip that's just about to happen next.
nations hundreds of years before you were born.
Your armies were defeated. You tortured and impaled thousands of people.
I was betrayed. Look what your God has done.
None of this would have happened, though, if Bram Stoker did not protect the staged rights of Dracula. It first went from book to the stage, and he protected the rights by doing a staged reading. And then later on, it was acted, starting in 1924 with Edmund Blake, and then 1927 with Raymond Huntley. Then the movie Nosferatu came along, which we're celebrating the 100th anniversary next year, which was obviously based on Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it was pirated, so they had some penalties to pay, but still a really good movie. And then we come back to Bela Lugosi, who is one of the greatest actors of Dracula of all time. He played Dracula on stage for many years, but his most famous was when he got selected to play in the 1931 Todd Browning Universal film, which I know for Cassandra and I, it's one of our favorite Dracula movies because it's the beginning. It's the first talking horror film of all time. Yes, go ahead.
Dacre, quisiera preguntarte algo en particular. En el Bram Stoker Estate, tú dices que desde que Drácula fue publicado en 1897, no ha salido de circulación. Y creo que pasa lo mismo en el cine. Cuando llega Drácula al cine con Nosferatu, al día de hoy todavía sigue siendo un personaje recurrente en películas, sigue siendo el personaje principal, se sigue hablando de él, se sigue mostrando en el cine. La pregunta es, en particular, ¿tú crees que el trabajo de Lugosi en esta versión de Drácula sea fundamental, el que le haya dado ese impulso a Drácula para seguir vigente en la ficción, en los libros?
Well, you know, that there was a big change made from Bram Stoker's Dracula, who was not a handsome, aristocratic looking Dracula like Lugosi. When Lugosi did it, it was iconic, and it has been ever since, because he's now the model for all the other guys afterwards. The dinner jacket, that suave look, the widow's peak on the hair, the accent, you know, everything that Lugosi did, because it was visual, which was different than the written word, that's cemented the Dracula on all the toys, the games, and costumes, and everything for eternity. This is the impact, the incredible impact that he actually did. And I'll say that even when the Spanish Dracula was being filmed, were filmed at nighttime. Lugosi was doing the acting during the day. Carlos Valleras and the others came and watched Lugosi because he was so iconic, and they watched him do his acting, and they did it later on that night. And many people think that the Spanish Dracula is actually better because they had better cinematography. It was more sexual. There was more scary. The female cast was actually better. So hats off to the Spanish Dracula in 1931. They really need to get a lot of credit for that.
¿Cuál prefieres tú, Dacre? ¿La de Todd Browning o la versión en español?
I know it's difficult to say because I'm talking to a Spanish festival. I would say there's different parts I like both of. You know, I like the fact that the Spanish one has much better film, you know, different shots, but I gotta love Lugosi. I mean, other than, and you've asked me, who's my favorite? Christopher Lee is my first, Bela Lugosi is my second. And the reason I chose Christopher Lee as my first is that Bela Lugosi only played it twice. Christopher Lee played 10 times. And he also had the advantage, though, of new and better technology, which is not really sort of unfair. There are other people that have played this. And you know, over the years, we could go into them, but you've asked me about my favorite movies, and you've got some favorite movies yourself. My favorite, there's two, because the 1992 with Gary Oldman by Francis Ford Coppola is the best story, but the most faithful to the novel is the BBC miniseries with Louis Jourdan. It followed the novel very, very closely. The Coppola one turns it into a love story, which it really wasn't, but the costumes were so good. The actors, Anthony Hopkins, Winona Ryder, Gary Oldman, they were fantastic. And to finish with, my final three that I really enjoyed was Stephen King's Salem's Lot. I love the book and the movie. Interview with a Vampire in '94. I love the book and the movie. And then 30 Days of Nights was a graphic novel. I love the book and the movie. What were some of your favorite ones?
Bueno, coincidimos en la versión de Coppola de 1992, también me parece una historia maravillosa. De hecho, como anécdota personal, fue esa película la que me motivó a leer el libro y lo leí realmente en una semana. Entonces, sí tiene que estar en mi top. También, pues, una película que me gusta mucho es de 1987, que se llama Near Dark, de Catherine Bigelow. Es una aproximación a los vampiros muy interesante. Me gusta mucho de Joel Schumacher, The Lost Boys. Fui una niña ochentera que le gustaba el cine de horror de esa década y esa película a mí realmente me volvió loca cuando la vi. Es muy, muy divertida y me gustó muchísimo. Y ya más grande, ya más adulta, me gustó demasiado, me enamoré de Dracula's Daughter. 1932, un añito después del Drácula de Todd Browning, una película que para mí rompe paradigmas de la sexualidad femenina, me parece muy polémica para su época y muy interesante. Las actuaciones son maravillosas y todo lo que pasa en esa película. Creo que es una joya que ha quedado olvidada de alguna forma o se le ha dado más poder o más fuerza al Drácula de Browning. Sin embargo, creo que se deben de poner los ojos en esta joyita que es Dracula's Daughter. Y por último, aunque no menos importante, sí coincido también en Terence Fisher y en el Drácula de 1958, ¿no?
Well, listen, we've spent a good time together, and I just want to say I want to end though. You've asked me about movies, but I also like television commercials. And the next slide is, to me, is a really cool commercial because in America, the Super Bowl of football, American football, is huge, and to have a vampire-themed commercial on the Super Bowl is incredible. So we'll just show that.
So soon you'll take me up in your arms, too late to beg you or cancel. I know it must be the killing time.
There he is. Party's arrived.
Fate up against against your will, and he will wait on.
And now the end, and I thank you very much, Cassandra. You have been wonderful. I love all your opinions as well, and thank you for your great questions. And Arturo, thank you for your translation.
Pues muchas gracias a ti, Dacre, por compartirnos todos estos detalles, toda esta información. Realmente creo que uno de los monstruos que tiene más información son los vampiros. Yo creo que no hay lugar en el mundo, no hay lugar del mundo que no tenga alguna creencia o alguna leyenda que gire en torno a un vampiro. Y conocer todo lo que trabajó Bram a lo largo de 7 años y que dieron origen a este libro, que te dieron a ti información para seguir desarrollando la historia, para seguir creciendo, todo lo creado por Bram hace tantos años. Te agradecemos muchísimo tu generosidad de compartir todo esto con nosotros, de hacérnoslo llegar, de conversar sobre cine, sobre vampiros, sobre folclore, sobre todas estas cosas maravillosas que forman parte ya de la historia del cine de horror, de la literatura de horror y pues de nuestras vidas. Muchísimas gracias, Dacre.
Well, you're very welcome. I've got a lot still left in me, so there'll be more products coming out, more times for us to chat together. And again, thank you, Planeta, for
Esta es una producción de cine.